So I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. I want to talk to you today about the fact that sometimes ignorance is bliss. You say, that's unusual. Isn't knowledge power? Well, it can be, but in real estate, there's a lot of things you need to know. There's a lot of things you want to know, but there's some things you don't want to know. Had an agent call me the other day with an interesting query. They had a property listed for sale. It was, say, 60 years old. It was north end, a side split, and it was back when they built them right. It was built with hardwood floors, built with plaster walls. It was well built. Had a buyer who was interested in this property, but the buyer said they wanted to put in an offer conditional on having the property walls inspected to make sure that there was no asbestos in the plaster. They'd heard sometimes that there was, and they wanted to double check. So the agent asked me about it. I said, have a conversation with your seller, because it's really their call, but advise them under no circumstances should they allow this to go ahead. Why do I say that? Because it's no win for the seller. I mean, I've never run across that asbestos in plaster. We have in drywall. There was Chinese drywall. It was laced with this asbestos, but I've never run across it. But let's suppose it's that one property in 10,000 that has some asbestos in the plaster. So the buyer does an examination, discovers that, and of course he walks. Now the seller has a problem. He has a latent defect that he's aware of, and he can't fix it. Well, I suppose he could. He'd have to rip the ceiling down, all the walls down. He'd take everything to the studding, have to give everybody in pressure-treated suits to do it. And in my opinion, it's really not an issue. I mean, unless you're going to gnaw on the walls, it's never going to come up in problem with creating airborne particles unless you're going to do renovation or something. But if, as a seller, if I got a clean bill of health, I'm never going to have anybody ask me, does there asbestos in the plaster? I haven't heard that question posed in 40 years. It's not apt to come up. So it isn't as though the seller can breathe a sigh of relief, but he's taking the chance, and I wouldn't want to take that chance to create that stigma. Let me just review latent and patent defects. As you know, a patent defect is something that's observable, and a latent defect is something that's hidden. And the rule in law is that a seller has an obligation to disclose all known latent defects, but not patent defects. There was a time we used to readily use the seller property information statement. I always liked them because I think the buyer should know what he's getting, the seller can tell what he's selling, and they should come up with a price that's equitable to both of them with no surprises later on. But the lawyers didn't like it. And the reason they didn't like it is they said the seller is saying things about his property that he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to disclose patent defects, and it's forcing him to do so. On the other hand, I think if you're not going to use a seller property information statement, at least use the residential information checklist. It's the same document, but it's not designed to be made available to the buying public, published at all. It's for your files. But the reason why you want to use it is you want to ask the questions that would reveal latent defects. You say, well, Wayne, you're contradicting yourself. You said you don't want to know, and now you do want to know. No, that comes down to agency again. The seller doesn't want to know what he doesn't know. But if the seller knows something, you as his agent have an obligation to discover that. And you have an obligation to disclose anything that's latent. I mean, I've had situations years ago, back before this was the norm at all, selling a property, and we discovered after the fact that there was an old, abandoned, unused, buried oil tank. Well, if I'm a buyer, I'd like to know that. We've had them come up where a swimming pool was disconnected and then just covered. It wasn't removed, it was just covered in. And so a buyer, if he goes to put in a pool, discovers there's one already there he can't use, but you got to get that one out first. So there's some things that are latent defects that the seller knows, and you don't want your seller to go into court later, so you need to find out those things. And to find them out, you ask the question. You use a residential information checklist, you ask those questions, and then anything comes to light that he might forget to tell you about, never even thinks about, like a buried oil tank or a buried swimming pool, you find out about it, and then you make sure you disclose it. But if the seller doesn't know, we don't want to find out. It's a little bit the same thing with surveys. For years and years, if I bought an investment property, and those of you who know my philosophy on investment properties, I buy them and keep them, I always had a survey. I wanted to know the boundaries of the property. I wanted to know if there were encroachments and so on. And it took a little bit of the burden off the shoulders of the lawyer who was representing me, because he could then examine the document, examine the survey, and he'd be able to see encroachments and so on. Now I'm telling people, don't get a survey. Well, let me qualify that. Don't get a survey before you close. There's times you're going to need a survey, but get the survey after. Why do I say that? Because now we use title insurance, and title insurance protects you for any type of unseen things like encroachments that you don't know about. If you know about it, then it's not covered. So I bought a property and I wanted to add a double car garage. I wanted to get the double car garage within 4 feet of the line, but I didn't want it to go 3 foot 11 inches. I want to know it precisely, so I got a survey. If you're going to put a pool in the backyard, you're going to want to know exactly how close you can get to the lot line and so on. You're going to want a survey. But don't get the survey first. Get the title insurance in place, and then if you get a survey and it discloses things you wouldn't have otherwise known because it wasn't a pre-known deficiency, then your title insurance will cover you. So there's some things you just don't want to know up front. I mean, if you're going to get personal health insurance because you're going on a trip, you don't necessarily want to do a medical before you go. You hope nothing comes up, but if it comes up, you want it to come up after the insurance is in place. So if it was a heart murmur or something, they're not going to say, well, we're not going to cover you in that area. So there's some things that it's just better off to be ignorant of. Ignorance is bliss. I want to thank you very much for joining me in this video. Look forward to talking to you again next week.